Welcome to part 4 on a short series of the Bible based on From Text to Translations by Paul Wagner. The Old Testament text, how has it been transmitted all these years? We have no original copies of any Old Testament text. So you might think it's a wonder we've got any Old Testament that's reliable at all. The reasons that we do not have originals are because of age and decay. These are old writings from many centuries BC. Also, calamities. The people who wrote these things or who kept the copies, they had gone through wars and other natural disasters, and so some things were ruined that way. Also, the scribes, the people in charge of writing those works and storing them, they had such reverence for their scripture that once it showed wear and tear, they would throw it away. And of course, they were in regular habit of making copies, so it wasn't like they didn't have them. They just threw away the old ones or destroyed them. And finally, people sought to destroy scriptures. We know as we read the Old Testament and the New that many people did not appreciate or did not agree with the writings of scripture and tried to ruin it. And so many were ruined that way. Eventually, what had been writings from a variety of places and perhaps with a little bit of variance became very standardized by the year 100 AD, and the Old Testament fragments that are found look very, very similar to each other. And different groups of Hebrew scribes were in charge of keeping very scrupulous copies of the standardized texts. From AD 20 to 200, a group called the Tanaim were in charge of keeping those copies, and eventually then from 200 to 500 AD, the Amoraim kept track of the copies, and they made new ones. Then the Masoretes from 500 to 1000 wrote and copied what we call the Masoretic texts. They made different notations, particularly the Masoretes did, and the Masoretic texts became very instrumental in what we see today as our copies of the Old Testament scripture. There are 15 places, so think about that, 39 books of the Old Testament. It takes up the majority of our current Bible. 15 places were where the Masoretic scribes found mistakes, or not even mistakes, actually questions. They had questions. 15 places is so few. They put little diamonds above the character to show that they weren't exactly sure. The other thing they did is they suspended a nun, which is a letter, a Hebrew letter, in 4 places. So we've got a total of 19 places that they marked to, and these 4 weren't places where they weren't sure of things. These were 4 places where people today think that they were trying to spare Moses some embarrassment because those 4 places in scripture show where some relatives of Moses had worshipped idols. And so that's the guess. So it's pretty incredible to think about how few questions the Masoretes had as they copied and transmitted scripture. When we read the Old Testament today, we see chapter divisions, we see verse divisions. Those are new, relatively speaking. Stephen Langton created chapter divisions in 1150, somewhere between 1150 and 1228, which was his lifetime. And then those were revised later on in about 1330. And then the verses actually had existed before chapters, and those were created by the Ben Asher family in 900. Textual criticism. You may have heard of criticism. It is a science or an area of study. Textual criticism is one of those areas, and it is defined as the science and art that seeks to determine the most reliable wording of the biblical text. And if you're like me, you might think criticism equals bad. We're saying the Bible is bad. But actually, it just means it's a very close and critical look to determine the most reliable wording of the biblical text. And it's important for these 3 reasons. 1, make sure the text is reliable. You understand the people who are copying the text. These are very, very old. They were written on sources not like our type on a printed paper today. They were written on things like animal skins or in clay pots or things like that. And so sometimes it's a little bit difficult to read what the letters look like. So it's important that people put a lot of effort into making sure that these are reliable copies. Secondly, it avoids dogmatism where there is question. So instead of making a case for something that may or may not be true, textual criticism insists, wait, this one thing is unsure. If you remember what I said about the Masoretic texts, there were very few of those places. Even so, it's important to know what those are. Finally, it helps the reader better understand what went into the different work in preparing a text, what the different notations might mean. A man named Shem-Aryahu Talman from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem said this: relatively few errors exist in textual divergences that materially affect the intrinsic meaning of the Old Testament scripture. That's from a man who has studied the differences in the ancient texts. Textual criticism is the work starts here, checking out the vowels. I said a little bit earlier that the original Old Testament manuscripts written in Hebrew, there were no vowels, and so at some point people inserted vowels to help with the pronunciation. Well, some of those were placed in error. That's called vowel pointing. So has the vowel pointing been corrupted at any point? So they would check that, and you can think of our English word. Perhaps you have a B blank D. Well, is the word bad or is it bed? In most cases might be pretty clear where you can tell which one it should be, but in some cases you might have to question it. And that's true with the Hebrew text, where they made sure that those vowels that they inserted were correct. Next, simple copying mistakes. We're all human, and in those days, they were not working. Again, they were not working with printers and typewriter or keyboards. They were copying from animal skins and with different kinds of writing utensils. And so sometimes they made mistakes. Sometimes they misread things. They were easy to spot, and the most common error is miscopying a letter. And so you can think about a word, and of course theirs was in Hebrew, but you can think about an English word. If you wrote a letter to look very much like what it should have been, but the letter's still off, you can really tell what the word is supposed to be. Basic principles of textual criticism include these. First of all, manuscripts must be weighed, not counted. And that means you must weigh how much a manuscript, how reliable it is. So it's not such a thing as saying we have 7 manuscripts. It's such a thing as saying we have this manuscript that's very reliable, this one that's much more difficult to read, and this one that we're not quite sure how much weight we can put into. So manuscripts must be weighed, not counted. Next, they must have to determine the most likely reading that would give rise to others. And what that means is a copier, a scribe, is a person, and they were men. He probably had his own personality show through his own system of thinking, and so the things he wrote probably made sense with each other. He probably followed a similar line of thinking with translating or copying this piece of the text versus that piece. Next, the more distinctive reading should be chosen. So if there's a question, one seems pretty clear, one reading or one interpretation seems pretty clear and the other one less so, they would opt to go with the more distinctive interpretation. The shorter reading ought to be chosen. And finally, the context should be considered. So that would be the grammar, the wording used, the text itself. What is it saying? Does it make sense? An example of an error that might be found, or maybe a question that might be found, is this. So in Scripture, it says, some options are these. Say, this is what the Lord declares. So the word say was a question based on which vowel should have been inserted where originally there were no vowels. So that's one interpretation. Next might be a word. This is what the Lord declares. So should it say, or a word? Finally, pestilence. This is what the Lord declares. And so the text critics would go through and they would determine according to the rules which makes the most sense here in this reading. And you can kind of discern as you're hearing this example, well, it's not significantly changing what's going on, but there is question, and people want to be as accurate as they can. Next, internal evidence. So the text itself, the scripture itself, is saying something. And so as that's read and determined, that itself sometimes provides meaning for people as they're giving textual criticism or considering textual criticism. Here's an example. Genesis 4:8 says in the Hebrew Bible, "And Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him." Well, and Cain told Abel his brother, is a pretty abrupt ending to that sentence. In fact, we might even think it's a sentence fragment. And so those text critics who have discerned and looked through and studied that text have determined that it should say, and Cain told Abel his brother, let us go into the field. And they've determined that from the textual context. So that is internal evidence of how to read that piece of the text. Some evidences or some pieces, some sources that are very reliable for textual criticism are these. The Masoretic text, so that was from the Masoretes. The Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans were people who claimed to be descendants of Manasseh and Ephraim, and eventually they were overtaken by the Assyrian Empire. And so those people, the Assyrians had their own people mixed with the Jewish people, and so eventually the population was not purebred Jewish, and so the Samaritans were kind of a little bit of a sect, and according to the Jewish people, they were inferior, and the Samaritans only read and followed the Pentateuch, and their copy of the Pentateuch is helpful, though it does show some nuances according to the way that their sect operated, a little bit different than the mainline Jewish people's ceremonial type thinking. The Qumran manuscripts were another one. Other Hebrew manuscripts that existed, the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a Greek copy of the Bible, but still very helpful because it was an early translation of what the Old Testament scripture should have looked like. The Syriac Peshitta, Jewish Targums, and the Latin Vulgate. So not just Hebrew works, different copies of the Hebrew works were helpful. Something particularly helpful was a discovery in the 20th century. Those were the Dead Sea Scrolls. So not until 1947 did such an old and complete copies of the Old Testament text exist. And when those were found in 1947 by a boy who threw a rock into a cave, and the rock ended up hitting something, crashing some clay, surprise to him, he found many, he found some scrolls, and people who had gone in to look and dig later found many more. They found many very thorough copies of scriptural texts from the Old Testament. And those were so helpful because those were about 1,000 years older than the Masoretic texts. And they showed that those Masoretic texts were very accurate. So some helpful texts exist, and you might wonder, well, why do we have so many? How is it helpful to have more than one? Well, the use there is you can compare one with another. You can compare those that seem more broken or less clear with something that's more clear, and they just provide a fuller picture that what we have as our Old Testament is indeed very reliable. After thinking about this pretty hard, I believe you can draw the conclusion that God is so very thorough in his work and so very sovereign in providing for us something that over thousands of years remains consistent. No matter what kind of human tools, what kind of human efforts against it, it still remains complete and thorough. And that is our Old Testament text.